Fat lunatic escapes with maniac brute. The iron gates of Hartford Insane Asylum exploded inward with a scream of torn metal. Rain hammered the courtyard. Lanterns swung wildly. Boots slipped on mud as orderlies shouted and scattered. Somewhere inside the stone walls, a woman screamed, not in madness, but in terror, while cold water was thrown over her restrained body and straps bit into her flesh. "Hold her still," a doctor barked. "Obesity hysteria resists treatment." Then the gates fell flat. A massive silhouette filled the entrance, rain steaming off his shoulders, hands clenched like iron hammers. Roderick Hale stood there, eyes burning, coat torn from climbing fences and walls, meant to keep monsters in and the world safe from them. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't shout. He simply said, calmly and loud enough to cut through the storm, "The fat lunatic you locked away belongs with me, and I'm taking her home." Chaos followed. Orderlies rushed him. One hit the ground with a broken collarbone. Another flew backward into a fountain. Shackles snapped like twigs when Roderick tore them apart. Doctors screamed about law and science and progress as he crossed the courtyard in long, unstoppable strides. Inside the treatment hall, Lillian Vanderbilt, soaked, shaking, corset biting into her ribs, looked up through wet hair and saw him. Not a savior, not a gentleman, a brute the world feared more than it feared cruelty. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. "They said I was insane," she whispered, stunned. Roderick met her eyes. "They said the same about me." Gunshots cracked. Horses screamed. A carriage gave chase as the mountain man vanished into the night, with a woman society had declared broken beyond repair. By morning, newspapers would call it a horror, an heiress abducted, a lunatic escaped, a maniac unleashed. But none of them yet knew the truth. This wasn't the beginning of madness. It was the beginning of freedom and a war against everything that called itself civilized. Before we rewind to understand how a wealthy woman ended up chained in an asylum and why a mountain man was willing to burn the world to save her, tell me this. Where are you right now, and what are you doing as this story finds you? To understand why a woman of one of America's richest families was chained like an animal, and why a man the size of a myth chose exile over society, we need to rewind. Hartford, Connecticut, 1885, wore respectability like polished silver. Brick townhouses, clipped hedges, men in tailored coats speaking softly about rail shares and futures. On the surface, it was order, progress, science. Beneath it, control. The Hartford Insane Asylum sat just outside town, deliberately distant. Families called it a place of healing. Everyone else knew it was where inconvenient people disappeared. Women who talked too much. Women who ate too much. Women who refused to obey. And that was where Lillian Vanderbilt had been sent. Lillian was 28 when her family signed the papers. Nearly 400 pounds, broad-shouldered, soft-faced, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been educated at home, taught law and contracts by her father in moments he believed no one was watching. She asked questions at dinner. She argued with uncles about inheritance. She refused corsets that cut her breath and dresses that hid her body like a shameful secret. They called it hysteria. In society gatherings, she was whispered about as the embarrassment. Servants snickered. Doctors nodded gravely and said her weight was a symptom of a deeper mental weakness. When her father died, the last protection vanished. Within a month, she was declared unfit to manage her affairs. Within a week, she was locked behind iron doors. At the asylum, Lillian learned the language of suffering, ice baths, starvation diets, electric shocks administered with clinical smiles, the word fat used like a diagnosis, not a description. When she protested, they wrote down delusions of autonomy. The town never saw this. Hartford preferred its monsters hidden. Far north, in the White Mountains, lived another monster. Roderick Hale had once tried to belong. Born huge, built even larger by mining and logging, he learned early that strength frightened people. He worked harder than anyone, spoke less than most, and kept his eyes down. It wasn't enough. When his younger sister was beaten by a factory foreman, Roderick intervened. One punch shattered bone, another cracked brick. Doctors testified that no sane man possessed such strength. The word maniac followed him into court. His sister died anyway. The charges were dropped. The label remained. Roderick walked away from towns, law, and doctors who measured humanity by how small it could be made. He built a cabin where winter killed the careless and survival meant honesty. No sermons, no treatments, just truth. Down in Hartford, the town revolved smoothly. Bankers funded railroads. Judges attended dinners hosted by the same families who filled the asylum. The sheriff deferred to doctors. Doctors deferred to wealth. No one asked whether the system healed or harmed. In saloons, men joked about the asylum's miracles. In parlors, women whispered relief that it wasn't them. On Sundays, preachers praised obedience as virtue, and always there was tension beneath the surface. Strikes up north, factory deaths covered up, asylums filling faster than hospitals, a society terrified of bodies it could not control. Lillian was trapped in the center of it, her intelligence dismissed, her will crushed under the polite language of care. Roderick was far outside it, hunted by rumor, avoided by travelers, known only as the brute who lived where civilization gave up. Neither of them belonged where they were, and when their paths crossed, it wasn't chance. It was the collision of two people society had labeled dangerous for the same reason. They refused to be small. Roderick Hale did not dream often, but when he did, the dreams were always the same. Dark corridors, stone walls sweating with cold, his sister's voice calling his name, thin and breaking. He would run toward it, boots pounding, hands shaking, only to find iron bars where a door should be. Doctors behind them, smiling, writing notes, calling it treatment. He woke from those dreams with his fists clenched and his heart racing, the mountain wind rattling his cabin like a warning. Even after 7 years alone, his body remembered what his mind tried to bury. Roderick's wound was not the strength everyone feared. It was the moment he realized that power meant nothing if the system decided you were wrong to exist as you were. He had wanted only one thing since leaving civilization behind: silence, a place where no one measured him, diagnosed him, or explained him away. The mountain gave him that. Snow did not care how large he was. Hunger did not fear his hands. Out there, strength was not madness, it was survival. Yet even in that silence, guilt followed him like a shadow. He had saved strangers from avalanches, pulled injured hunters from ravines, and then vanished before thanks could turn into fear. He never stayed long enough to be known. Knowing led to questions. Questions led to cages. So his desire was simple and impossible at the same time: to protect without being claimed, to exist without being owned by other people's fear. Lillian Vanderbilt's nights were different, but no less brutal. She dreamed of mirrors, endless rows of them reflecting her body from every angle. each mirror surrounded by men in white coats pointing, measuring, nodding. In the dreams she tried to speak, but her mouth filled with cotton. Her thoughts were sharp, precise, desperate to be heard, but the mirrors only showed flesh. She woke from those dreams hungry, not for food, but for dignity. Before the asylum, Lillian had known exactly who she was. She liked numbers. Contracts made sense to her in a way people did not. She saw patterns others ignored, especially the quiet theft hidden inside legal language. Her father had noticed. He never said it out loud, but when they talked alone, he listened. After his death, her family treated her mind as a decoration and her body as a defect. Her weight became proof that she could not be trusted. Every pound was another reason they used to take her voice away. Inside the asylum, the punishment was not pain alone. It was erasure. They told her she was sick for wanting autonomy. They told her that hunger was virtue, obedience was recovery, and silence was health. Each shock, each forced bath, each day without food was meant to teach her the same lesson. You do not belong to yourself. Her fear was not death. It was becoming what they said she was. A thing, a diagnosis, a case study that proved them right. But beneath that fear burned a goal she never admitted even to herself: to expose them, to speak loudly enough that the walls would crack, to reclaim her body as evidence, not shame. When Roderick tore through the asylum gates, neither of them understood yet why the moment felt inevitable. He saw her and recognized the look immediately. Not madness, not weakness. The look of someone who had been cornered by authority and refused quietly to disappear. She saw him and understood something just as dangerous. Here was a man who had already been labeled irredeemable. Someone the world had given up trying to correct. Someone who did not apologize for the space he occupied. On the mountain, as Lillian recovered, the old wounds surfaced slowly. She flinched when food was offered, waiting for rules. He watched her eat like a man witnessing a miracle, anger simmering beneath his calm. Not at her, at what had been done. Roderick's hand sometimes shook when he touched medical tools, even simple bandages. Lillian noticed and said nothing, filing the detail away with a lawyer's precision. Understanding was her way of surviving. What they wanted became clearer with every passing day. Roderick wanted to protect her, not as a debt, not as a rescue, but as a choice. To stand between her and the world without turning into another jailer. Lillian wanted to stay, not because she was hiding, but because for the first time, her body was not treated as evidence of failure. She wanted to rebuild herself where no one demanded she become smaller to be acceptable. Neither said the word love, but both knew this was no accident. It was a reckoning. The first sign that the mountain had noticed them was the sound of hooves. Roderick heard it before the horse came into view. A single rider, moving cautiously, not drunk, not lost. That alone made him dangerous. He stepped out of the tree line with his rifle resting openly in his hands, not aimed, but unmistakable. The rider stopped. He was older than Roderick, lean where Roderick was massive, his coat worn thin by decades of weather rather than neglect. A U.S. Marshal's badge hung openly at his chest, dulled by scratches. His eyes took in the cabin, the smoke from the chimney, the tracks in the snow, and finally Roderick himself. "Didn't expect to find you alive," the man said calmly. "Name's Samuel Price." Roderick did not lower the rifle. "Didn't expect to be found." Price nodded, as if that were reasonable. "Hartford's making noise. Doctors screaming about a stolen patient. Rich family screaming louder. Behind Roderick, the cabin door creaked. Lillian stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in wool, standing tall despite the tremor in her hands. She looked nothing like a lunatic. She looked like a woman who had survived something and refused to shrink afterward. Price's gaze shifted to her. He took a long breath. "So that's her," he said. "Doesn't look insane to me." "That makes two of us," Lillian replied. Roderick glanced back, surprised not by her courage, but by how steady her voice was. Price caught it too. "Funny thing," the marshal said, dismounting slowly. "I've escorted a lot of patients back to places like Hartford. Screaming ones, violent ones. You don't fit the pattern." He reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, and produced folded papers, legal documents, warrants. "They want me to bring her in," he said. "They want me to bring you in too, Hale. Kidnapping, assault, destruction of property." Roderick's jaw tightened. "And?" Price met his eyes. "And I buried my wife in an asylum like that." The mountain went quiet. "She was inconvenient," Price continued. "Too outspoken. Wouldn't stop asking why the mine paid widows less than men. They called it melancholia. Said rest would cure her." His fingers tightened on the papers. "She didn't last 6 months." Lillian felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear, recognition. Price looked at her then, really looked. "If I do my job by the book, I take you back. If I do my job right..." He let the sentence hang. "What do you want?" Roderick asked. "A record," Price said. "Proof, not just your word. Something that forces the law to see what it doesn't want to." Lillian stepped forward. "I have that." Both men turned to her. "I memorized procedures," she said. "Dates, names, methods. I've reconstructed them from memory already. With time, I can put it into language the courts can't ignore." Price studied her like a chessboard. "And you'd testify?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "If it means no one else disappears the way I almost did." Roderick felt fear for the first time since the escape. Not fear of the law, fear of losing her. Price saw it and shook his head. "I'm not here to separate you. I'm here to make a deal." He pointed toward the valley. "You stay hidden. I buy you time. In return, she builds a case. When Hartford comes knocking again, it won't be with chains. It'll be with subpoenas." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Roderick lowered his rifle. "All right," he said. "But if they come early..." Price smiled thinly. "Then they'll have to go through me first." The marshal mounted his horse and turned back down the trail, leaving behind something far more dangerous than a warrant: hope. The mountain did not give sanctuary for free. Winter tightened its grip on the White Mountains like a clenched fist. Snow erased trails overnight. Wind scoured skin raw. Each day Roderick woke before dawn, checked the perimeter, reset snares, and scanned the ridgelines for movement that did not belong to deer or fox. Lillian watched and learned, not because he asked her to, but because surviving meant understanding the rules of this place as much as the rules of men. Their first trial came quietly. A supply wagon failed to arrive. Roderick had arranged a discreet exchange with a trapper who didn't ask questions. Ammunition, flour, lamp oil. When the man didn't show by the third day, Roderick knew something was wrong. He found the wagon burned in a ravine 5 miles downslope. No body, no tracks leading away. Only a scrap of cloth pinned to a tree with a knife, Hartford Asylum seal. "They're testing us," Roderick said. Lillian felt the old fear stir, the instinct to disappear, to go silent, to make herself smaller. Instead, she took out her notebook. "Then we respond by becoming louder," she said. The second trial came with gunfire. 2 hired men pushed up the mountain at dusk, sloppy but armed, emboldened by pay and authority. They didn't bother with stealth. They believed the mountain brute would panic or flee. They were wrong. Roderick led them into a narrow pass where sound echoed and footing betrayed the careless. He fired once, deliberately high, shattering a rock face above them. Stone and snow cascaded down, forcing them to retreat in panic. One fell and broke his ankle. Roderick dragged him out of the cold and left him at the trailhead with a warning carved into a plank. "She is not property." By morning, a bounty appeared in the lowlands. $500 for Roderick Hale. Alive preferred, dead acceptable. That night, Roderick sat alone by the fire, cleaning his rifle with hands that shook despite his strength. "I've done this before," he said quietly. "Ran, hid, fought back until the ground filled with graves. It never ends." Lillian stepped closer, the firelight catching the scars on her wrists where restraints had once cut her skin. "It ends when the truth stands in daylight," she said. "Running kept us alive. Now speaking keeps others alive." The third trial tested her instead of him. A woman arrived at the cabin at dawn, half frozen, dragging a child behind her. The boy coughed blood. Pneumonia advanced. "I was told the witch lawyer lived up here," the woman said through cracked lips. "They said you wouldn't turn us away." Lillian hesitated. Helping meant exposure. Exposure meant risk. Roderick didn't look at her. He simply opened the door wider. Lillian worked through the night, applying what she'd learned from both the asylum infirmary and her own stolen education. Warmth, steam, careful feeding, no restraints, no starvation. The boy lived. By the end of the week, others came, quietly, carefully. Workers injured in mills, women dismissed as hysterical, men labeled unfit and discarded. The cabin became something else, a refuge, and that was the fourth trial. Word spread faster than silence ever could. Samuel Price returned, this time not alone. He brought papers, court notices, and a warning. "Hartford is pivoting," he said. "They're no longer claiming she's insane. They're saying she's dangerous, that she's influencing people, undermining order." "They called that hysteria, too," Lillian said flatly. Price nodded. "They're also filing an injunction to seize her notes." Roderick's temper flared. "They touch her, She stopped him with a hand on his arm. "No," she said. "If we meet force with force, they win. They want a monster." She turned to Price. "I need witnesses, former patients, nurses, anyone who saw what they did." Price grimaced. "That puts targets on their backs." "Targets already exist," she said. "I'm just naming them." The fifth trial nearly broke them. A nurse arrived one night with evidence hidden in her skirts, records, treatment logs, death certificates altered to read exhaustion or weakness. She was followed. Shots rang out in the trees. Roderick returned fire while Lillian dragged the nurse inside. One bullet grazed Roderick's side. Another shattered a window. The attackers fled, but the message was clear. Lillian sat with Roderick afterward, pressing cloth to his wound, hands slick with blood. "This is my fault," she whispered. "You wanted a quiet life." He met her gaze, unblinking. "I wanted a life that meant something. You gave me that." By spring, the case was no longer theoretical. Lillian compiled affidavits, testimonies, a systematic dismantling of the asylum's practices, using their own language against them. She wrote until her hands cramped, until the words blurred, until she dreamed in statutes and dates. Roderick stood guard. He escorted witnesses through the forest. He learned restraint, choosing when not to pull the trigger. Each challenge hardened them and softened them at the same time. He became more than a weapon. She became more than a survivor. And Hartford realized too late that the mountain had given them exactly what they feared most: a voice. The truth did not arrive like a gunshot. It arrived like a letter. Samuel Price brought it up the mountain on a gray morning when fog swallowed the pines and even sound seemed unsure of itself. He didn't sit. He didn't remove his coat. His face carried the kind of strain that meant bad news had already aged overnight. "They moved the case," he said. Lillian looked up from her desk. "Moved it where?" "Federal court. And they didn't just move jurisdiction." He swallowed. "They changed the story." Roderick felt his stomach drop before the words landed. "They're not defending the asylum anymore," Price continued. "They're sacrificing it." Lillian stood slowly. "That makes no sense." "It does if the asylum was never the point," Price said. "They're blaming one man, a reformer, a philanthropist, someone the public trusts." Roderick's jaw tightened. "Who?" Price hesitated. "Judge Nathaniel Crow." The name hit like ice water. Crow, the man whose portrait hung in Hartford's town hall, the man who'd spoken publicly against abuse, who'd funded charities for the unfortunate, the man Lillian had cited in her own arguments as an example of enlightened authority. "He testified in favor of patient welfare for 20 years, Lillian said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "He helped write the very protections I'm using." "That's why this works," Price said. "They're saying he was misled, that the abuse happened beneath him, that he's the one who uncovered it and shut it down." Roderick slammed his fist into the wall. "They're turning the villain into a hero." "And making me irrelevant," Lillian whispered. "Worse, dangerous, a radical." Price nodded grimly. "They're reframing you as an agitator who manipulated vulnerable witnesses. They're questioning your sanity again, subtly, respectfully. But it's there." Silence filled the cabin. That night, the mountain felt heavier. Lillian sat alone by the fire, staring at the pages she'd written, every citation, every careful argument. All of it suddenly felt fragile, like paper armor. "I built my case on their system," she said quietly, "and their system just swallowed it." Roderick crouched beside her. "Then we burned the system." She shook her head. "No, that's what they expect from you, from us." She looked up at him, eyes rimmed red but sharp with resolve. "Crow didn't just overlook the abuse," she said. "He engineered it." Price had left one more document behind, a ledger copied in a careful hand. Funding trails, quiet transfers, payments to asylum doctors routed through charitable fronts. Crow's signature was everywhere. "He needed women declared incompetent," Lillian said, "especially wealthy ones, estates frozen, assets managed by courts. By him." Roderick felt a cold fury settle in his chest. "So, my sister—" "Wasn't an accident," Lillian finished. "Neither was me." The realization nearly broke her. For days, she withdrew, ate little, slept less. Roderick watched helplessly as she paced, reread documents, tore out pages, rewrote them. The old doubt crept back in. "What if they're right?" she said one night, voice barely audible. "What if I am what they say? Too emotional, too angry, too much?" Roderick knelt in front of her, taking her hands with deliberate care. They locked you away because you could see. They call that madness because it scares them. She pulled away. And what if exposing Crow destroys everything? He's powerful. If we lose, we don't run, Roderick said, firm but gentle. Not again. She looked at him then, really looked, at the man who had lived half his life hunted, at the scars he carried because authority had labeled him dangerous instead of listening. I won't hide any more, she said at last, even if it costs me everything. Price returned days later with a warning. Crow knows you're close, he said. There's a warrant being prepared, not for arrest, for commitment. Lillian exhaled slowly. Then we go to town, she said. Roderick stared. That's suicide. No, she replied. That's daylight. She gathered her papers, tied them with twine, and placed them in a satchel. They want me silent or caged, she said. I choose to speak where everyone can hear. Roderick slung his rifle over his shoulder. Then I stand beside you, he said, not as a brute, as a witness. As dawn broke over the white mountains, they stepped onto the trail, leading down toward Hartford. They knew one thing with certainty now. The final battle would not be fought in the shadows. It would be fought where law, lies, and fear stood exposed. Hartford woke under a hard noon sun, the kind that exposed every crack in brick and every lie written on a man's face. The gallows stood unfinished in the square. Timber stacked beside the courthouse as a reminder of how quickly justice could become spectacle. Church bells rang once, then fell silent. People gathered anyway. Word had traveled faster than trains. They said the fat lunatic had come down from the mountain. They said the maniac brute walked beside her. They said something was about to break. Judge Nathaniel Crow arrived precisely at 12. Black coat, silver cane, a smile practiced in mirrors. He waved gently to the crowd like a benevolent father. Deputies flanked him, hands near holsters, but relaxed. Power, when secure, did not rush. Then a murmur spread. Roderick Hale stepped into the square first. Boots heavy, shoulders squared, rifle slung but untouched. Every step echoed against the courthouse stone. Conversations died mid-sentence. Men shifted their weight. Mothers pulled children closer. Behind him came Lillian. No corset, no veil, no attempt to shrink. She walked slowly, deliberately, a satchel clutched against her chest. Her presence bent the crowd in a way shouting never could. Faces that once sneered now stared, uncertain whether to look away or keep watching. Crow's smile faltered. "This is highly irregular," he called out. "Miss Vanderbilt, you should be represented by counsel." "I am," Lillian replied, voice steady. "By truth." A ripple passed through the crowd. Crow's eyes flicked to Roderick. "This man has outstanding accusations against a system you built," Lillian cut in. She stepped forward. Deputies tensed. Roderick did not move. Lillian reached into the satchel and withdrew the ledger. "This," she said, holding it high, "is the record of how women were declared hysterical, not because they were ill, but because they were inconvenient, because their bodies, their voices, their wealth could be controlled." Crow laughed softly. "You expect them to believe you over me?" "I expect them to read," she said. She turned and handed the ledger to a reporter from Boston who had arrived that morning, drawn by rumor and smoke. Names followed, dates, transfers. Estates frozen the same week diagnoses were signed. A woman cried out. A man swore under his breath. Crow's cane struck the ground. "This is slander," Roderick finally spoke. His voice carried without shouting. My sister died in your care. The square went still. You told her family she was dangerous, he continued. She was bruised when I saw her last, starved, afraid. She died 3 days later. Crow's composure cracked. You're a violent man. Everyone knows that. Yes, Roderick said calmly, and I learned that violence from men like you. The deputies hesitated. The crowd leaned in. Lillian stepped beside Roderick. They taught us to fear bodies that could not be controlled, she said. Mine was called diseased. His was called monstrous. But the real madness was what they did to us in the name of order. Crow raised his voice. Marshal! The marshal did not move. Instead, he removed his hat. I've read the ledger, he said quietly, and I've buried enough people from that asylum. Crow's face drained of color. A train whistle screamed in the distance, a reminder that time did not stop for powerful men. Crow reached for his cane. Roderick was faster. He stepped forward, placing himself between Crow and Lillian, not threatening, simply immovable. Don't, Roderick said. Crow looked around. No one came to his aid. The marshal nodded to his deputies. Nathaniel Crow, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. Handcuffs clicked shut. The crowd did not cheer. They breathed, as if a pressure had finally lifted. Lillian closed her eyes just for a moment. Roderick felt her hand find his. They stood there together while Crow was led away, the sun unflinching overhead, the truth finally dragged into open air. Hartford did not change overnight. Towns never do. But something cracked, and once cracked, it could not be sealed again. The asylum gates were locked within a week, not ceremonially, not triumphantly, but with an awkward silence that followed the removal of a lie too large to defend. Doctors resigned quietly. Records vanished from offices and reappeared in newspapers 2 states away. Families who had not asked questions for years began asking them too late and too loudly. Judge Crow awaited trial in a house stripped of authority. His name was still spoken, but now all was followed by a pause. Lillian Vanderbilt did not return to society. She stood once in front of her family's lawyers, listened to them explain how much easier her life could be if she stayed quiet, and then walked away without signing a single paper. Her inheritance followed her anyway, dragged behind the truth she had already set loose. Roderick Hale became a rumor again, but a different one this time. They said the mountain brute had turned away from violence. They said he walked openly beside a woman once declared insane. They said the White Mountains had grown strangely welcoming. Up there, smoke rose from a cabin each morning. Papers were stacked on a heavy table beside hunting knives and law books. Letters arrived from women who had been confined, from men who had buried daughters, from doctors who wanted to atone without being named. Some were helped, some could not be, but none were ignored. In town, the gallows wood was repurposed into courthouse benches. No one admitted why. And on certain evenings, when the wind carried down from the mountains, people swore they heard laughter where there had once only been screaming. A sound not of madness, but of survival. Out on the frontier, people liked to believe madness lived in wild bodies and broken souls. But the truth was harsher. Madness lived wherever power learned it could hurt without being questioned. In a world where laws were written by those least willing to be bound by them, dignity became an act of rebellion. And sometimes love was the most dangerous crime of all, not because it was loud, but because it refused to disappear. Lillian and Roderick did not win by becoming acceptable. They won by refusing to ask permission to exist. So now I ask you the same question every frontier story eventually asks. In a land where fear often speaks louder than justice, and where it is easier to label than to understand, where would you stand if the crowd turned ugly? Right now, as you hear the end of this story, where are you and what are you doing? Tell me in the comments.